Now watch me become what I can become, using protest as a form of fighting for your own individuality. This is what is at the heart of Kurt Vonnegut's text, and we're going to look at that in this lesson. My name is Bernadette Tedesco, and in this lesson we're going to look at Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut as part of our Creating Text framework, writing about protest. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce the text. I'm going to talk about some of the key ideas about protest. I'm also going to give you some context, audience, purpose, and form. And I'm going to unpack some of the vocabulary, text structures, and language features within the text to help guide you in your own writing. Some of the relevant study design dot points included are looking at the role of the mental text as models of effective and cohesive writing, vocabulary, text structures, language features. I'll also be looking at the purpose, context, and audience, the range of ideas, the different language modes and structures and how they're used to create meaning, and the ways that the purpose of the author hones the use of language. As always, pay attention to these boxes on the side to help you with key terms and any difficult vocabulary. Harrison Bergeron is a satirical dystopian short story. What that means is that he uses humour and irony to criticize his own society and society in general. And he also sets it in a dystopian future, so an imagined society that is characterized by being really oppressive. It was written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and it was first published as a standalone short story in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in October 1961. And it's been republished numerous times. This mental text focuses on the framework of protest from a unique position compared to our other texts. Rather than protesting discrimination of a specific disadvantaged or persecuted group, the narrative is protesting an ideology. It's protesting totalitarianism in particular, so governments that seek to have complete control over everything. It's also protesting the suppression of individuality, especially of those who are exceptional. And it's protesting the idea of extreme equality or absolute equality, a state where everyone has the same rights, opportunities, and possessions without any distinction or differences. Don't mistake this for believing that Kurt Vonnegut doesn't believe in social equality, which he does. He believes very strongly in social equality, but he is using this example of extreme equality to highlight the issues with totalitarian governments. It raises questions about the trade-offs between equality and freedom and the potential consequences of attempting to enforce absolute equality at the cost of individuals. Some of the key ideas about protest relate to types of protest, causes, risks, and consequences. One of the ideas has to do with the desire for freedom. The idea that rebellion is natural and inevitable when someone or a group of people are oppressed, because humans desire, naturally, it's an innate desire for freedom and self-expression. And if that freedom and self-expression is oppressed, then we have a natural desire to rebel. It also looks at protest as a symbolic act, making a statement of defiance rather than a practical attempt to overthrow the government. So he's looking at the idea that protest doesn't necessarily have to bring about change in order to be meaningful and effective. It's the act of trying to defy that is important. Yeah, even if you know that it's not going to achieve what you want, even if you know it's futile, because it is such a symbolic act, it therefore is meaningful and important. There's also this idea of oppression and suppression of individuality. Vonnegut suggests that the main cause of protest is the government's oppressive policies aimed at suppressing individuality, personal freedom, and expression. And that's really quite interesting because when you look at all of the movements, you see that they all involve particular groups being oppressed based on a characteristic that they share. But it can be applied to those groups not being able to be different to the majority. So for women, for example, they aren't men, so therefore they are suppressed. For people of colour, they aren't white, so therefore they are suppressed. It's their difference from those in power that forces them to be suppressed or oppressed, and that is what causes people to protest. That people should be allowed to be different is what Vonnegut is saying. And they should have that freedom to express themselves and their differences. Another idea is the consequences of individual rebellion. Individual rebellion against a totalitarian regime is both courageous and futile. So we have examples of texts that talk about the power of the collective. In this text, we have an example of the futility of an individual, of one person, without having others joining in. And that being just an individual protesting often comes with severe consequences when you're protesting against a regime or a group that have complete power. He's also talking about the suppression of rebellion, so that there are entrenched power structures within a community that are often extreme in their attempts to ensure nobody rebels. So it's not just a government saying, no, that's wrong, but there are structures like the media or like the police force that are in place that ensure nobody rebels, that support that ideology of oppression. So quite deep thoughts about protest. To understand Vonnegut's piece, you need to understand him a little more. His personal context is that he served in World War II and he was captured by Germans and became a prisoner of war. You might have heard of his text called Slaughterhouse-Five. It gives examples in a quite abstract and strange way of his experience of being a prisoner of war who was held in a slaughterhouse during the bombing of Dresden. And then as a prisoner of war having to leave and clean up the bodies and the destruction that the Allied forces, his own country, caused to the city that he was being held captive in. And the shame and the guilt that comes from seeing what the Allies did during the war, but also knowing that he was fighting with that group and owed his alliance to that group, and the conflicting feelings that brought for him. And we see this throughout this text to a degree as well. His feelings about war and his anti-war, anti-violence message. You also need to know that this was written during the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of intense ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, primarily Russia. Both countries had really fierce ideology, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but they equated loyalty to one's country with agreeing with that ideology. That if you did not agree with the way that we think society should be, then you are a traitor. And both countries treated their citizens in that way, in quite extreme ways. It also was written around the time of the Vietnam War, which is a time when America, the large-scale involvement in the Vietnam War began in 1960, 1961. It was caused by America's involvement was linked to the Cold War, and Vonnegut was openly critical of the Vietnam War and America's involvement in that war. These all influence his purpose. His purpose is to criticize governments, not just Russia, not just America, but governments that try to control their citizens, that force citizens to conform. to one set of ideals and suppress people's individuality, making everyone equal. Yeah. So his purpose is to criticize governments that try to force citizens to conform. I am going to unpack the ideology of the Cold War a little bit because it does come through in Harris and Bergeron. Knowing that Vonnegut was American, you might instantly assume that he agreed with the American ideology, but not necessarily. He agreed with parts of it. The American capitalist ideology is based on liberal individualism. Basically, that means that they prioritize the protection of individual rights. So it's all about individuals having particular rights, and those rights are set in stone, including the freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and the right to private property. These rights are seen as essential, to a free and fair society. Liberal individualism believes that there is a limited role of the government in people's lives, that the government's role is to protect individual rights rather than control individuals, that it's not about doing things to individuals but more about protecting them from having things done to them or having rights taken away. It supports a market-based economy, which doesn't really come into our text too much, and acknowledges that individuals have different values, beliefs and lifestyles, and it promotes tolerance and respect for differing perspectives. Okay. Now, the other side of the ideological debate that was happening during the Cold War is based on Marxism-Leninism. It aims to establish a society where the means of production are owned collectively by the workers and controlled by the government. So that means all the factories, all the schools, everything that happens is produced in a society is controlled by the government on behalf of the people. Yeah, and so that means the government's role is to do everything for the benefit of its citizens. That rather than having every single individual person being involved in every single decision, they elect someone who makes the decision on their behalf. And they control everything. They control all the schools, all the companies within a society. The ultimate goal is to achieve a classless and stateless society where goods are distributed according to the principle of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. The collective is prioritized over the individual. The group's need are more important than any one person's need. Yeah, and that was probably one of the main differences. The liberal individualism focused on individuals having the right and the freedoms to be themselves. Marxism-Leninism focused on the collective right, and the group's needs are more important than any one person's. That's the main difference. It's also worth noting that the opening passage of the American Declaration of Human Rights is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so Vonnegut's really unpacking what it means to be equal and how each of these countries go about trying to unpack what that means. And in doing so, they force their citizens to agree with their take on how individuals should be treated compared to the collective. We know a little bit of the background now. It's important to think about who his audience are. His audience will be fans of his work. So people who have read his other work will be attracted to reading this piece of text. They will be people who like his distinctive writing style and his recurring themes of human folly, absurdity, and the struggle against oppression. Also noteworthy is that he published this piece in a science fiction collection, and so it is people who like science fiction and dystopian fiction who would be part of his target audience. They would like this style of writing. And Finally, people who support liberal individualism will also be attracted to this text because if you interpret it in a really oversimplified way, it could be used as an allegory to explain the dangers of extreme attempts to force equality, to force everyone to be treated exactly the same, which is what they believe communism was trying to do. And so liberal individualist supporters would probably be attracted to this story as well, even though that might not have been his original target audience. His form is satire, which I've already talked about. He uses a lot of humour as a tool for social change. It is dystopian, and so again, it's used to criticise society, but it takes the criticism further, often serving as a warning or a cautionary tale. And it's a short story, which is perfect as an act of protest because they are more accessible than a novel. It doesn't require people to read the whole text. They can experience his message in just a short, sharp sitting. He also has some really interesting, Vonnegut is famous for his short stories and his insights into story writing. He has some interesting insights into narrative arcs as well. It helps explain Harrison Bergeron's death and his parents' reactions if you understand that he's not trying to have that beginning, climax, ending that we think of it typically when we think of short stories. He's trying to shape his story in a particular way so that it reflects the ambiguity of real life. And so it's quite interesting. If you get a chance, I recommend you have a listen to the link below where he gives a lecture on the shape of stories. It's quite entertaining, and it could give you some different options for planning your own short story if you want to do one. He also, by the way, wrote a list of 8 rules of writing, which are also quite interesting, but I would definitely recommend you look into that shape of stories if you're interested in short story writing. I'm now going to unpack the vocabulary, text structures, and language features in a couple of different sections from the text. I want you to think about in this opening, how does Vonnegut effectively engage his audience of science fiction and dystopian fiction fans in the opening of his short story? The year was 2081 and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th and 213th Amendments of the Constitution and the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. So notice the repetition of the word equal. This is clearly about extreme equality, that there is no individualism, and you would pretty quickly see that he's talking about when the collective good is put above individual rights. So really quickly that's established. Also notice the allusion to Constitution, the American Declaration of Human Rights and Constitution, that opening line that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So that reference to God and the law and equality, that's a direct reference to the American Declaration of Rights. And he also is referring to that here. So he's alluding to that. The dystopian world is established here when he's talking about the year, what it's like now, and talking about this handicapper general establishing who's in charge. The dystopian setting of having someone who oppresses the other people. There is a little bit of humour in the use of the term handicapper because it's not a very formal term. It's sort of slang that he's using there for what should be a really formal position. So he's straight away putting a little bit of humour in there through the word choice that he's made. It's a simplistic name and a ridiculous situation that he's stating in a really matter-of-fact way, as if it doesn't really matter. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime, and it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. Again, we have that silly reference to springtime driving people crazy. And we also have the dystopian phrase, HG men. Note that he's combining the dystopian world with real elements like the Constitution, adding in humour in order to engage the audience. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard, which is a ridiculous situation, by the way. Their son has been taken away. It's tragic, yeah, but Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts, which is also meant to be funny because it's indicating that most people can't think about anything in short bursts. That's average. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. Again, we have that really simplistic, oversimplistic wording, a statement that is ridiculous, stated in a way that sounds matter of fact, that thinking too deeply is unfair. Yeah, so he's using humour here. With this multiple choice activity, I want you to think about the allusion that Vonnegut makes to the United States of America's Declaration of Human Rights and Constitution. Think about why he does that. Why does he include that at the beginning of his story? Hopefully you were able to recognise that the correct answer was C. A reads to emphasise the superiority of the government in the story over the principles of democracy. That's not what it's about. It's not about emphasising one government as being superior in terms of its democracy. He actually is criticising both America and Russia. To suggest that the characters in the story are enjoying the same freedoms and rights as guaranteed by these documents. No, he doesn't actually think that it's a good thing that people have been deliberately oppressed in order to be equal. So he's not saying that they're enjoying their freedoms. To explain that the ideal of equality had been successfully achieved. So the American ideal that we're all equal before God has been successfully achieved in the story. No, not quite. That's not what he's trying to do. What he's trying to do is to highlight the contrast between the idea of equality from the documents and the oppressive reality depicted in the story. So he's trying to get his audience to think about, what does the document actually mean when it's saying we all have these rights to be equal, compared to what we're seeing in practice in the story. That's not what the document is actually saying. Let's continue, and I'm going to move now to a chunk in the middle of the story. I'm now going to jump a little bit to the middle of the story, where George and Hazel have been sitting, watching the TV, having a little conversation about the ballet, the dancing that they're watching on TV, and talking about what it would be like to be the handicapper general. And I'm now going to jump into the bit that's right before the climax. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." Okay, hopefully you noticed that this is again him adding humour in, and how frustrating it would be to one listen to an announcer who can't speak a sentence without being able to say it clearly, and two, how frustrating it must be for the announcer to be in such a public situation trying to express himself and being unable to. So he's adding humour here. There's also the characterisation. The announcer is clearly unsuitable for this position. He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. "That's all right," Hazel said to the announcer. "He tried." So Hazel, remember, is the mother who's got quite average intelligence, and she's saying, isn't it good that he tried, even though he's completely unsuitable for the role? It sort of indicates what Hazel is like and the way she thinks. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. He's being ironic here. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin, she must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous. And it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. Here we have an example of how unfair it is that the government oppression is, and why there is a need to protest. And she had to apologise at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. How do you make a voice uncompetitive? That's again the humour and irony coming in. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." All right, so there's a couple of things I want you to notice that Vonnegut is doing. He's using humour throughout this whole thing to undercut how ridiculous this situation is, how ridiculous the situation of extreme equality is, by providing us with examples of exceptional individuals like the ballerina. She's exceptionally beautiful. She was the strongest and most graceful. Her voice was warm and luminous, and comparing them with examples of the government trying to oppress that individuality and her exceptionalism, because they made her wear a hideous mask, not just a mask, but a hideous one, and she had huge handicap bags. And there's also this idea of making her voice uncompetitive. What is an uncompetitive voice? In this case, her uncompetitive voice is a grackle squawk, so she makes herself sound ridiculous rather than luminous and melodic. All of these things are used to point out the ridiculous situation they're in. The use of humour throughout the text says, as a form of protest in itself against the absurdity of the government's actions. By pointing out how ridiculous it is, they're showing that the government has no right to try and control these aspects of a person, that the government should not be trying to force people to conform to a particular way of speaking, a particular way of acting. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. Pointing out that this is something that Vonnegut deliberately did. He didn't have to have the image go right side up and then sideways and then upside down. He chose to do this to point out the ineptitude of society in dealing with serious situations because of the things that they'd put in place. And we have another example of an exceptional individuality, an exceptional individual. He's 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the H-men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches beside. So we have that oppression. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. So he's really setting up this unrealistically awesome individual in order to show the extremeness of how unfair what the government is doing. And to offset his good looks, the G-men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. So it's not just that Vonnegut is using humour to make Harrison, his main character, look ridiculous, but it's the humiliation of it, the humiliation of suppressing his own greatness, suppressing the things that make him unique. If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him. Note here that this is a particular idea about protest, that idea of institutions trying to control protest. Reasoning with Harrison would reveal the unfair oppression of those who are exceptional. People would be able to listen to him and understand that what he's saying makes sense. And so the government and the media are saying, don't talk to him to avoid that idea spreading. The government doesn't want his exceptionalism to be celebrated in any way. They want to suppress the protest. There is a shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. He is fighting back against their attempts to stop his voice being heard. And he's doing it forcefully. If dystopian fiction is usually dark and oppressive, why does Vonnegut use humour, irony and satire in Harrison Bergeron? Does he do it to highlight the silliness of the government's attempts to enforce equality and suppress individuality? Does he do it to create a sense of hopelessness and despair among the characters and readers alike? To show the resilience and strength of the characters in the face of adversity? To illustrate the inevitability of totalitarian control in dystopian settings? Or, I don't know. Pick one, see how you go. Hopefully you were able to recognise that A was the correct answer. He's trying to highlight the silliness of the government's attempts to enforce equality and suppress individuality. He's trying to show that that will never be a good thing, that it's silly to try and do that. It's not B because the humour doesn't create a sense of hopelessness. It's not C because the humour is not used at times when the characters are being resilient. And it's not D because it's not illustrating the inevitability of totalitarian control. That's not the message that he's trying to get across. And so that leaves us with A, to highlight the silliness of the government's attempts and to make fun of the government and those who support the government. I'm now going to move to the ending of the story. And what has happened in between is that Harrison has asked for one of the ballerinas to step up and be his empress, and they've played this amazing music and done this beautiful dance, the most amazing dance that's ever occurred in world history. And that brings us to the point where we're at now. And this has all happened in live broadcast. It was then that Diana Moon Glampus, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampus loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone into the kitchen for a can of beer. Some things to note. We have here that they were shot, that the government is oppressing them by killing them, and we have this idea about protest, in particular the consequences of individual protest, that is easy to oppress an individual or to silence an individual if they don't have the support of a group outside of themselves. It's also talking about the suppression of rebellion, and that it's not just the government saying naughty, that they will often use violence to suppress even murder, but also that the media is usually complicit in that suppression of rebellion. We have, as soon as that happens, the television tube burned out, that there was a blackout. The media refuse to continue showing what happens. They help support the silencing of what's happened so that there's no more dialogue or reaction for society to see and respond to. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You been crying?" he said to Hazel. "Yup," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." This is humorous and ironic. She just saw her son get shot in front of her on television, but she can't remember that. So it's funny. It's ironic that she's just saying something real sad, but she can't remember. "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," says Hazel. She was referring to the sound that he heard in his head and his reaction to it. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel. "I could tell that one was a doozy." Dun-dun-dun. And that's how the story ends. It ends with this ridiculous repetition that obviously wasn't what George wanted her to do. But it indicates, one, she's not intelligent enough to realise that he's just using a turn of phrase. Also, it's indicating how the focus of the rebellion has shifted straight away. It had zero effect. They're just going back to their normal lives as if nothing had happened, sort of indicating that the impact of the protest was futile because they are so submissive to their rulers, to their government. Something else to notice is that idea that that individual rebellion is futile because people don't want to think about bad things or sad things. They want to ignore the sad things that are happening in society. And so people who protest often are ignored, not because what they're saying isn't right, but because the rest of society doesn't want to hear it. They can't be bothered hearing it, or it's easier to forget about the sad things and just focus on the nice things in life. So just a summary. Harrison Bergeron was written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. and published in 1961. It was written in the midst of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. His audience included fans of his other work, readers of science fiction and dystopian fiction, and supporters of liberal individualism ideology. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's who he was aiming for, but they would have been fans of this work. The purpose was to criticise totalitarian governments and to express concern about suppressing people's individuality. The form was satirical dystopian short story. Some of the key ideas related to why we have this innate desire for freedom, why we protest, the purpose, the importance of symbolic protest, oppression and suppression of individuality, and that is often one of the causes, that the consequences of individual rebellion are often that they are unsuccessful, and that suppression of rebellion often involves more than just a government, but also media and other social structures work towards suppressing a rebellion. Some of the vocabulary and text structures we looked at are repetition of key words. We had allusion. We had humour, irony and satire was a big one. And then we also had the elements of a dystopian genre that we saw throughout and that really strong characterisation. Some of the key terms we looked at were satire, allegory, dystopian fiction, short story, allusion and irony. Please join me in our next lesson, City of Gold.